Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that very kind introduction. President Lyndon Johnson once said that was the sort of introduction which my father would have enjoyed and my mother would have believed. So I'm extremely grateful to you. This session which we're having this morning is, of course, about Afghanistan and Central Asia. And I want to begin, if I may, by just pointing out, perhaps reminding, that the whole question of Afghanistan has to be seen in the context not just of the last 8 years, but in the years since the end of the Cold War. Indeed, Afghanistan itself, through its defeat of Soviet forces, contributed, accelerated the very end of the Cold War itself. I remember that in 1983-84, when I was a deputy minister in the foreign ministry in the United Kingdom, visiting Peshawar in Pakistan, visiting an Afghan refugee camp, and I was invited to speak to the Afghan refugees who had fled from the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And I made a speech about how I hoped that one day they would go back to their country and that the Soviets would leave. Of course, my speech was in English. It had to be translated into Pashto, the local language. I was rather alarmed the following day when the British ambassador informed me that the translation of my speech had said that Mr. Malcolm Rifkind, visiting the foreign minister, yesterday addressed Afghan tribesmen in Peshawar. He called upon them to continue the jihad against the Soviet infidel. not quite the words that I'd used. It wasn't so much the Afghan reaction I was concerned about, it was Margaret Thatcher's reaction in London that made me slightly more nervous. But of course, it's worth, actually she was quite impressed, I have to say, as it turned out. It's worth remembering, though, that it was not just the consequence in terms of the Soviet failure in Afghanistan that precipitated the end of the Cold War. It's often forgotten that the end of the Cold War was not just about the end of communism or the end of the Cold War itself. It was also the end of Europe's last empire, the Russian Empire. And that meant not only the liberation of the Baltic states and Ukraine and countries in Europe, but also it meant the creation of for the first time almost, of Central Asian states. Afghanistan's neighbors ceased to be the Soviet Union, but became Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and so forth. And what we saw also was that the end of that Cold War was not just the end of history, as was unwisely said at the time. It unleashed new forces. And one of the most potent and dangerous of all these new forces has been the growth of terrorism, international terrorism, and in the context of our discussion today, terrorism sponsored by Islamic extremist forces, and that has its heart in Afghanistan and in Pakistan next door. Now, I make that remark because it is crucial to understanding how we deal with the situation, why we're there in the first place, and why matters go forward. There have been a number of wars over the last 20 years. Some of them have been wars of choice, some are wars of necessity. The arch war of choice was, of course, Iraq. That was a war that need not have happened. Iraq had not attacked anyone at that particular time. There were ways in which these matters could have been taken forward, and it deeply divided the international community. We must not forget that Afghanistan is not Iraq. It was not a war of choice. It was not an intervention that divided the international community. It had its origins in an event which has not yet been mentioned this morning. The attack on the Twin Towers, killing thousands of people in New York, organized and planned by Al-Qaeda from a secure base within Afghanistan, given support by the then Taliban government. And it was that background that led not to America or NATO. It led to the United Nations Security Council unanimously, with Russian support, with Chinese support, with the support of every member state, believing that intervention was necessary to ensure that terrorism of that kind could not be organized and dealt with again from within Afghanistan. And even to this day, the intervention, the military presence in Afghanistan is not just an American or a British or a NATO idea. It continues to have the support of Russia and China and other member states. Indeed, the Russian foreign minister just a few months ago said it would be a disaster for the whole region if NATO's efforts in Afghanistan were to fail. And that is a point we must not lose sight of, because however difficult and disturbing developments may be, the kind of challenges we face are not just about Afghanistan, important though that is, not just about NATO or the West, but about the international community as a whole. Now, Afghanistan was always going to be more difficult. I said there were wars of necessity. Sometimes you cannot avoid a war, and I'm calling it a war because that's what it is. But quite often with wars of necessity, the solution, although difficult, in one sense is relatively straightforward. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the solution was quite straightforward. The coalition forces threw him out. End of war, mission accomplished. When the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands of the United Kingdom, we had to send a naval force. We expelled the Argentinians from British territory. Mission accomplished. End of war. The difference about Afghanistan is that although it's a necessary war, the solution is not so straightforward. We're not trying simply to reverse something that has already happened. Sadly, that cannot be reversed. Thousands of people who were slaughtered in New York, acts of terrorism of that kind. What we're trying to do is to ensure that they cannot be repeated. That for the future, Afghanistan will be a country that cannot harbor international terrorism and cannot be a source of support for Al-Qaeda or for people like that. Now, I make this point with tremendous emphasis because I want to make a central point very, very clear, which I hope will command support, but it sometimes causes confusion. When NATO, the international community, first went into Afghanistan, in order to get the maximum popular support, and because we believed in it as well, we didn't just talk about expelling the Taliban because of their support for Al-Qaeda. We also talked about creating a democracy, ending corruption, removing the poppy trade, giving women equal rights, all of which are hugely desirable objectives. But we created the impression, deliberately or unintentionally, that unless we succeeded in these objectives over a finite period of time, the whole operation will have failed. And it was always a naive and unrealistic assumption. Because hugely desirable though these social and cultural and economic objectives are, it never was possible to contemplate that within 5 years or 10 years, Afghanistan would be a healthy democracy, that corruption would have largely disappeared, that women would be treated by male Afghans as full equals, and that the poppy trade would no longer be a problem. And we must keep coming back to remember, we didn't invade Afghanistan for that reason. There's corruption, sadly, in 50 or 60 countries around the world. There's a lack of democracy in almost as many. We don't normally go around contemplating sending armies in to deal with it. That's what actually did happen in the case of Iraq, with all the disasters that flowed from that. So we must bear in mind that the timescale for our military and political objectives is quite different from the timescale for our social, economic, and cultural objectives. And the success in one should not depend and not be presented to the public as if it depended on the other. Now, with regard to our primary reason for being there in the first place, I would suggest to you we've already succeeded. Al-Qaeda, for all practical purposes, has been emasculated, has been largely eliminated as a political force within Afghanistan. Its remnants are in the caves on the Afghan-Pakistan border. They're in other parts of the world. Al-Qaeda may still represent a serious threat. But within Afghanistan itself, at this moment in time, they are not a threat. The objective is to ensure that that is irreversible, that they cannot come back again. And therefore our whole approach to the Taliban has to bear that in mind. At the end of the day, whether the Taliban or some other political force in Afghanistan or the government of that country is not for us, it's not for anyone except for the Afghans. That's for the Afghans to decide. It's their country. And if they want the Taliban, or if they cannot stop the Taliban, and there were no other international implications, that would be very sad. But that would be for them to deal with, as it would be in any other country around the world. So we are not, and I say this as a private citizen, but I nevertheless said, and I don't want to be misunderstood, I strongly want to see democracy in Afghanistan, but we are not committed to any one government or any one person or any one party. What we are seeking to do and what we must continue to do is to ensure that the progress that has already been achieved in terms of Al-Qaeda and international terrorism is achieved, is maintained, and is not reversed. And that the social and economic cultural development, that is also hugely important, but that is over a generation. The objective is to show to Afghan community that our support there is not short-term, it's long-term, as it should be in any comparable country. Now, what that says to me is that, of course, as the former president of Latvia so rightly said, there is a need for political development as well as military action. But the two are also, as she herself emphasized, not mutually exclusive. Dare I say it, it was Frederick the Great who once said that diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. And although I wouldn't necessarily take the parallel too far, it is indeed a not invalid comment. So what does that suggest our objective should be now as we look to the next few weeks, months, perhaps 2 or 3 years? I would suggest that the ingredients for success are as follows. First of all, President Obama was right to say we need to have what has been described as a military surge. Not because by itself it will win the war and eliminate the Taliban. That would be, I think, unrealistic. But we have to send a signal. The psychology is hugely important. As it was mentioned earlier, what is often seen in Afghanistan as hugely important is how long will they remain? How determined are they to actually carry out these tasks? And so the surge, the increase in military support, I believe sends a vital signal that the international community, not just NATO, the international community, are determined to maintain a military presence for as long as is necessary to ensure that terrorism cannot return. The second point linked to that is, of course, there has to be a political dialogue. And that political dialogue must not just be amongst non-Taliban sections of the community. The Taliban themselves are a fairly amorphous group. They come overwhelmingly from the Pashto part of the population, about 40% of the total. Then there will be many within their ranks who are more concerned about Afghanistan than they are about Al-Qaeda. And insofar as there seem to be, significant numbers of people within the Taliban movement who are prepared to renounce any relationship with Al-Qaeda, to give secure commitments that Al-Qaeda would never be allowed to flourish in the country again, then of course we must encourage the developments that might lead to some new kind of coalition. The United Kingdom has enjoyed its first coalition for 60 years. If the United Kingdom can experience a coalition, then I think President Karzai could as well, without it being the end of civilized life as we know it. So I think political dialogue, the creation of a wider Afghan government, if that is deliverable and helps secure the overall strategic objective, is the second part of what has to be a broad strategy. The third is one that also has not been mentioned this morning, but I think there is a need for the international community to insist on Afghanistan and Pakistan developing a much more intimate relationship. It's not often realized that the relationship between those two countries, between the governments of those two countries, has been quite poor going back to 1949. That to this day, the Afghan government does not recognize the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the so-called Durand Line. It's never been recognized by Kabul as the legitimate border. Now, I'm not going into the merits of that. What I do say is that the absence of recognition of that kind is precisely why there have been elements within the Pakistani government and in their security forces that have been ambiguous in their opposition to the Taliban. Why indeed in the past they actually supported the Taliban and helped to bring them to power. And if Afghanistan and Pakistan want to actually maximize the prospects for peace in that region and stability between their two countries, then they have it within their own power, and particularly the Afghan government has it, to make serious progress on diffusing and eliminating the distrust that is at the heart of many of the Pakistani concerns about not just this Afghan governments going back a long way. That's the third ingredient. The fourth is what we were discussing earlier, economic and social development. But that has to be, for the reasons I've suggested, conducted over a generation. It has to begin, it already has begun, it has to be generous, and it has to be made clear to the Afghans it will not cease when NATO military forces are no longer required. That way we have an economic and social commitment which is realistic, and unless that commitment is based on realism, it won't be believed anyway. The fifth ingredient, it has to be regional. I mentioned a few moments ago that this is not just a NATO operation or a Western operation or an American operation. It is the international community, and that Russia and China are as committed in political terms as we are to the success of what is happening. I believe more has to be done by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by other countries to build on that political support, to get more practical ways of supporting from Russia and from China. Already significant logistical help is given, but I think more could be done, because it would not only be practical, it would also send a political message to London, to Paris, to Berlin, to Washington, that this is not just the West in NATO, isolated, unpopular, doing something that nobody else believes in. The fact that countries like Russia and China and others were speaking out clearly and unequivocally, as they have done, but not enough, and in not sufficient visible ways, would be a very great political bonus. The final point I make is this, that we are all conscious of the fact that at some stage NATO forces have to be gradually withdrawn, and that should be linked to the training of the Afghan army, which is already happening, and we gradually hand over responsibility and power to Afghan forces. But I just want to suggest that that should not be the end of the story, because even when that process is complete, on all the evidence available today, it's highly unlikely that the Afghan government, whoever composes that government, will have full control over every square inch of Afghanistan. And therefore what I hope will happen is that as we withdraw from Afghanistan, that a treaty will be freely reached with the Afghan elected government that will enable and permit international forces not to remain in Afghanistan as ground forces as they currently do, but to provide support in the form of air power or for special operations, so that if in future years, if in any part of the country where the Afghan government's writ does not run, international terrorism again raised its ugly head, then speedy action could be taken to deal with that. And that's not an unrealistic scenario. It's worth remembering that the Taliban fell not because of ground forces from NATO going into Afghanistan. The removal of the Taliban from power originally was a combination of American, to some extent British, but mainly American air power combined with anti-Taliban Afghan ground forces. And therefore, when NATO does withdraw its troops from the ground, longer-term security, until the situation has been entirely resolved, could be met in that way. So I conclude these comments by saying that it's not a question of being optimistic or pessimistic about Afghanistan. I was once told the difference between the optimist and the pessimist is that the pessimist was someone who believed things could not be worse. The optimist is someone who knows they could be. And that is true in the case of Afghanistan. We continue to have massive international support. Terrorism is the primary reason why we are there. But if we are able to combine that in generational terms with the transformation, not just of Afghanistan, Pakistan is even more of a challenge in so many respects because of the sheer size of that country and its strategic and geopolitical position, then we will have made a contribution not simply to our own security, but to the peace of that region as well. And it needs it, it deserves it, and the quicker it gets it, the better. Thank you very much indeed.
Sir Malcolm Rifkind has kindly agreed to also take your questions. Please, who would like to go first? Let's start with the ladies first. Okay.
If I could just answer them very briefly, one at a time, I'd prefer, but I'll be very brief, I promise.
Thank you very much, Bettina Mushaid. Just a quick question with respect to Pakistan. I mean, you very much pointed at the Durand line as a source of grievance to the Pakistanis, but of course many also write that there is a bigger geostrategic context at play, and that is everything that's being understood, at least by scholars at strategic depth, that Pakistan also sees a reason for keeping an influence in Afghanistan. If you can expand a little bit on the wider geopolitical context.
Well, Pakistan is a country with enormous problems. It's a nuclear power, so if it fails, that is hugely disturbing to the wider world. It's a country of well over 100 million people and growing dramatically. But it's not even a stable democracy, unlike India, which has a stable democratic system. So we have a vast strategic interest in Pakistan, and I believe that historically that will be actually much more of a challenge even than Afghanistan is at the moment. Afghanistan difficult though it is, very difficult though it is, and the solutions will be different, but it has to be a massive priority for the wider international community if we're all going to sleep easily in our beds.
Okay, maybe I'll start in the back. I want to make sure I give many a question. I'll come back. So, Sir James, yeah, please.
Good morning. To my understanding, terrorism is also an international phenomenon which can't really, if you talk about terrorism, it's more like an international network which is spread all around the world. Can you really concentrate on one source? I'm not talking about one country. Of course, there are other regions which are influenced by terrorism, but can you really concentrate on one source or one region if you talk about terrorism?
Well, at the risk of oversimplifying, the answer is yes. You are right to say that there are many terrorist problems in other countries. Much terrorism around the world is terrorism directed by the citizens of one country against their own government. So Baader-Meinhof in Germany many years ago, or the IRA in the United Kingdom because of the problem of Northern Ireland. That's local to a particular country. What is disturbing and unique about the situation we have about extreme Islamic terrorist organizations is they are global in their targets. Their enemies is not a particular government in their own region or in their own territory. It has a global impact, and we've seen that not just in the United States, we've seen it in Indonesia, we've seen it in the United Kingdom, many countries around the world. So if you have a global threat, there has to be a global response. And sadly, all the evidence points to the main source of that being in the Middle East, particularly in Pakistan and Afghanistan area, but also in one or two of the other surrounding countries. That is the harsh reality.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
Thank you. Jochen Hippler, I'm teaching political science in University of Duisburg-Essen. I'm just a bit confused. If I read the new strategy correctly, including on the military side, including what General McChrystal had said, the emphasis very much is on, winning the loyalty of people and talking about governance to win the loyalty of people. That's what he is basically emphasizing very much, and this is the key thing of winning the war. And what you're emphasizing, which I understand very well, is focusing on fighting terrorism, which is something else. You are basically trying to restrict, if I read your words correctly, you're restricting the operation to go back to the old goal of fighting terrorism in Afghanistan, kind of ignoring that it has moved to Somalia and Yemen from Afghanistan to some degree. But the current debate is on loyalty and governance. And I just wonder how it fits together, what you say in the current strategy.
It fits in this way. NATO is a military operation. NATO is not involved in social work. It's not involved in economic and social development, although it has a deep interest in it. The NATO operation has to be, what contribution does the military dimension make towards stability and peace in Afghanistan and through that in the wider region? Simultaneously, and this is what General McChrystal is referring to, others, not NATO, others, governments, organizations, the international community, have to help governance, economic development, social development. But I have to repeat the point, that cannot, even if it goes well, that's not going to be delivered in the same time frame as the presence of international military forces in Afghanistan. We all hope, who knows, we all hope that NATO forces will be out in 5, 6, 7, 8 years at the very, very most. We are not going to have got rid of corruption, or have an ideal democratic system, or the elimination of poppy trade and so forth in that time scale. And don't tie the one to the other. That is a generational thing, not just because it's Afghanistan. The same is true of so many countries around the world. And unless we're realistic about it, we not only fool ourselves, but we actually lose the support. We're all democratic governments, all democratic countries. We lose popular support, because the public say, but you promised that you'd be getting rid of corruption and the poppy trade and drugs and so forth, and you haven't done it. So why are you there in the first place? So you have to be very clear about the reason you're there and the way in which you can deliver things in different timescales. If you don't do that, then you will live to regret it.
Okay, 2 more final questions from the front.
Fadwa Al-Gindi, Qatar University, anthropologist. What natural resources does Afghanistan have that the West is very interested in, or control over resources? And what banking system will be at work after all this is
Well, I think I'm allowed about a sentence to reply. No, I think in terms of Afghanistan's importance, Afghanistan has not been blessed with huge natural resources. It's, relatively speaking, a poor country in terms of natural resources, but its geostrategic position is hugely important. It is its proximity to what used to be the Soviet Union, the countries of Central Asia, to India, to the Gulf, to the Middle East, that gives it its importance and its significance. And beyond that, we have an ethical and moral obligation to help that country, as we do many other countries in similar economic and social circumstances.
Final question?
Minister, I'm a former President of Seychelles. Now I'm working for peace. I'm a believer in the fact that peace cannot be legislated, that peace cannot be forced upon a nation. Peace must require a change of heart. Now, if I listen to your address, you very much referred to the incident of the 11th of September, and you pointed to the Al-Qaeda factor. Now, in man-human relationship, again, relationship between states, one sometimes can understand reasons for one nation to dislike another nation. But when you get to the level of hate, I think there's something fundamental. In my view, the attack on the Twin Towers in New York went beyond a situation of despise and revealed more a question of hate. Now, the United States being what it is, the leading power in the world, supreme, perhaps the supreme military power, don't you think it would have been, instead of just rushing into a situation of tit for tat, into a situation, oh, you people have hit us, now we shall show you our power, that the Presidential Commission of Inquiry should have been established to determine why in the world a group of people had come to have so much hate for a country which is, after all, committed to democracy and worldwide welfare.
Well, President Manchin, you raised an important point. I think the point I would stress in response is that what the United States did after 9/11, when thousands of its people had been destroyed in the attacks on the Twin Towers, the initial demand to the Taliban government was to hand over Al-Qaeda, the people responsible, who were themselves claiming responsibility. There was no doubt as to who was responsible for this atrocity. If the Taliban government had been prepared to hand over the people responsible, then there would have not been any NATO or other American intervention in Afghanistan. It was when the Taliban considered it and then refused, absolutely refused. That is when it went to the Security Council, and when the Security Council unanimously said we cannot tolerate such a terrorist attack. That has to be, it's not just punishing for what had happened. Al-Qaeda had every intention of continuing that kind of behavior if they could operate from a secure base within a particular member of the United Nations. So there was no choice in the matter. That was a unanimous view of the United Nations. The question of what causes Al-Qaeda to exist and so forth, that is a separate, very important issue, but not one that could have in any way prevented or delayed a very swift response if similar ghastly atrocities were not to be repeated elsewhere. Thank you.